two very old patterns are worth noticing before we start. For thousands of years, in courts and empires most of us will never visit, the people who held power studied exactly how it was won and lost, refining a set of moves that repeat with uncanny precision from ancient China to Renaissance Florence to the corridors of Versailles. And on a much smaller scale, the same handful of moves get made every week, in offices and families and friendships, by people who have never read a page of history, and would be startled to learn they are following a script written centuries before they were born. This is a tour through 48 of those moves, gathered and named by the writer Robert Greene, drawn from generals and courtiers and con artists and kings, who all discovered, independently, the same short list of what actually works. One of these laws quietly costs people a decade of goodwill before they even notice it is operating. Another explains why the most impressive people in any room are so often the quietest ones in it. None of this is offered as instruction. It is offered as observation, the way an old map is offered, not to tell you where to go, but to show you where the paths already run, worn smooth by everyone who walked them before you. Settle in. There is no rush here, and the shape of power turns out to be stranger and calmer than the word usually suggests. In August of 1661, a French finance minister named Nicolas Fouquet threw the most extravagant party Europe had ever seen, at a chateau so beautiful it made the king who attended it look, by comparison, unimpressive. 3 weeks later, Fouquet was arrested and would spend the rest of his life in prison. The chateau was Vaux-le-Vicomte, and Fouquet had spared no expense, hiring the finest architect, the finest gardener, and the finest playwright in France to stage an evening meant to honor his king, Louis XIV. Fireworks lit the gardens. A new play by Molière premiered for the occasion. Louis arrived, walked the grounds, ate the meal, and said almost nothing. He left that night having understood something Fouquet had not intended to teach him, that his own palace, his own taste, his own everything, had just been quietly outdone by a subordinate. Within a month the king's agents had assembled a case, real or convenient, and Fouquet was gone. The lesson underneath the anecdote is older than Louis and outlives him. People in power do not simply want loyalty. They want to feel, without needing to say so, that they remain the most impressive person in whatever room they occupy. A subordinate who is competent is useful. A subordinate who is visibly, undeniably more brilliant, more charming, or more beloved than the person above them, stops registering as an asset and starts registering as a rival, whether or not that was ever the intention. This is not really about talent. It is about the emotional experience of the person holding power, which talent has an uncomfortable habit of disturbing. The safer path, the one history's most durable courtiers understood without ever writing it down, is to let your gifts serve the person above you rather than eclipse them. Make your patron look good for having chosen you. Save your most dazzling moments for when no comparison is being drawn. It costs something, this restraint. It is also, for a very long time, how people managed to stay employed, stay trusted, and stay alive. Fouquet had built the more beautiful chateau, and Louis kept the throne anyway. There is a particular kind of person who announces every plan before they have taken a single step toward it, and history is not especially kind to them. Armand Jean du Plessis, better known as Cardinal Richelieu, took the opposite approach for the better part of 30 years, and it made him one of the most powerful men in Europe without most of Europe noticing until it was far too late to do anything about it. Richelieu entered the French court as a minor bishop with modest prospects, in a world crowded with dukes and princes who had every reason to see a churchman's ambition coming and crush it early, so he made sure they never quite saw it. He cultivated an air of piety and caution. He let more flamboyant rivals burn themselves out competing for the king's attention, while he remained useful, agreeable, and apparently uninterested in real power. By the time his actual ambitions became visible, they were no longer preventable. He had already become essential. The logic here is simple enough to state plainly. A stated goal is a target. The moment other people know what you want, they can maneuver against it, delay it, or claim credit for blocking it, often before you have made real progress. A goal that stays private, on the other hand, meets no organized resistance, because no one knows there is anything to resist. This is not the same as dishonesty in every sense of the word. It is closer to patience with a purpose. A willingness to let your actions speak only once they have already succeeded, rather than announcing them in advance and inviting a chorus of objections. Modern life offers smaller versions of the same pattern constantly. The colleague who mentions a promotion they are hoping for gives every rival in the office a head start on undermining it. The one who simply does the work, quietly, and lets the result speak, tends to arrive at the same destination with far less friction along the way. Richelieu never announced that he intended to run France, and by the time anyone noticed, he already had. Rome fought Carthage 3 times over more than a century, and it was only after the Third War, when the city was leveled and its population scattered, that Rome finally stopped worrying about Carthage at all. The first 2 wars had each ended with Carthage defeated but intact, its walls standing, its trade routes recovering, its old resentments cooling only until circumstances allowed them to reheat. Each partial peace bought Rome a few decades of quiet, and then reliably another war. It was only the third and final conflict, ending in 146 before the Common Era, that broke the pattern for good, because this time Rome did not simply defeat Carthage, it erased it, and the threat, along with the city, never returned. There is an uncomfortable logic underneath this history that shows up again and again wherever conflicts are settled short of their conclusion. A rival left standing, even a badly weakened one, retains a memory of the grievance and, given time, the resources to act on it. Mercy toward a defeated opponent can look like strength in the moment, and often is celebrated as such, but it frequently just postpones a rematch to a later date, one the victor may be less prepared for than they were the first time. History's most durable outcomes, according to this reading of it, tend to belong to a conflict so completely that there is nothing left to come back for. None of this translates cleanly or comfortably into ordinary life, where total destruction of an opponent is rarely available and rarely wise even where it is, but the underlying caution survives the translation. A half-resolved conflict, a rival merely inconvenienced rather than genuinely reconciled, has a way of resurfacing precisely when it is least expected and least convenient. The old warning was never really about cruelty for its own sake. It was about finishing what you start, so that you are not still fighting the same battle, quietly, for years afterward. Carthage's harbour silted in within a generation, and Rome never looked over its shoulder again. Ask anyone who has been badly let down in business or in politics, and there is a good chance the person who let them down was not a rival they were watching carefully, but a friend they had stopped watching at all. This sounds cynical stated so plainly, but the underlying mechanism is almost mundane. An enemy is a known quantity. You expect an enemy to work against you, so you build in the caution, the double-checking, the contingency plans that make their opposition survivable. A friend earns something more dangerous than trust. They earn the absence of scrutiny. Once someone is filed away, mentally, under the category of ally, most people simply stop asking whether that person's incentives still align with their own. And it is precisely in that blind spot that damage tends to happen, not because friends are secretly worse people than enemies, but because they operate with far less resistance. History supplies plenty of cases where a trusted intimate, a childhood companion elevated to high office, a loyal deputy handed real authority did more harm through a single moment of self-interest than any declared rival ever managed, simply because no one thought to check their work. Meanwhile, a rival brought in specifically because they were known to be capable and watched precisely because their loyalty was never assumed, often performs more reliably, held accountable by a wariness that friendship never has to earn. None of this argues for coldness toward the people actually close to you in your own life. It argues for something narrower and more useful, the habit of separating affection from oversight, so that liking someone does not quietly become a substitute for verifying that their interests still run parallel to yours. The safer habit, quietly practiced by wary courtiers for centuries, was noticing the gap before it widened, rather than after. The friend who was never quite watched closely enough had, in more than one old story, turned out to be the only one who mattered. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand served under a revolution, an emperor, and 2 kings of France, surviving every regime change that destroyed the careers of louder men around him, and one habit shows up in nearly every account of how he managed it. He rarely said more than he had to. Talleyrand's silences were not the silence of a man with nothing to say. Contemporaries who worked alongside him were certain he thought more, and understood more, than almost anyone in any room he entered. But he treated words the way a careful gambler treats chips, spending them only when the return was worth it, and otherwise letting other people talk themselves into revealing far more than he ever gave up in return. There is a reason this works, beyond simple mystique. Every sentence spoken is information handed to whoever is listening, a small piece of your reasoning, your position, or your intention that they did not have before and can now use. A person who talks freely, especially under pressure, tends to reveal their hand long before the moment when revealing it would actually help them. A person who says little forces everyone else to guess, and guessing is exhausting, and quietly, a form of control, is quietly, a form of around. This does not mean saying nothing. It means noticing that the impulse to fill a silence, to explain yourself, to keep talking until the tension in a room eases, is usually working against your own interests rather than for them. Silence unsettles people far more than speech does, because speech gives them something to respond to, and silence gives them nothing but their own imagination. Talleyrand once observed that language exists to disguise thought, and his own silences disguised it better than any sentence he ever spoke. There is a particular kind of ruin that has nothing to do with what actually happened and everything to do with what people believe happened. And courts throughout history were built almost entirely around this distinction. In the tightly watched world of a royal court, a rumor could travel faster than any denial, and a single well-placed whisper about disloyalty, incompetence, or scandal could undo years of careful work before the accused even learned there was anything to defend against. The truth of the matter mattered less than the speed and shape of the story that reached the king's ear first. Careful courtiers understood this and built their entire strategy around it, cultivating the reputation they wanted people to believe before anyone else got the chance to build a different one for them. Reputation functions like a kind of shorthand that other people use to decide how to treat you before they know you personally. A reputation for competence earns the benefit of the doubt when something goes wrong. A reputation for unreliability turns even a genuine success into something people quietly discount. And because reputations move through gossip and impression rather than evidence, they are disproportionately easy to damage and disproportionately hard to rebuild, which is exactly why the old advice was to guard the thing before it needed defending, not after. This is less about vanity than it sounds. A strong, established reputation acts as armor, absorbing minor mistakes and unfair attacks that would otherwise land directly. A fragile or contested one leaves a person exposed to every rumor that comes along, true or not. The court gossip who ended a career rarely had to prove a single word of it, only make certain the story arrived first. Phineas Taylor Barnum understood something that many talented, hard-working people never quite grasp, that in a crowded world, being ignored is a far worse fate than being controversial. Barnum ran shows built on spectacle, exaggeration, and occasionally outright fabrication, and critics accused him constantly of humbug. He rarely bothered to defend himself against these accusations, because the accusations themselves kept his name in every newspaper in the country, and newspapers full of his name meant crowds full of paying customers. Whether people came to admire him or to see what all the fuss was about mattered far less than the simple fact that they came. This runs against a common instinct, which is to seek approval and avoid criticism at almost any cost. But approval, quietly earned and never discussed, produces very little momentum. A steady, unremarkable competence rarely travels beyond the small circle of people who already know you. Attention, even mixed or hostile attention, travels. It gets repeated, argued about, and remembered, and in a world where being forgotten is the more common fate, being remembered, for almost any reason, tends to open more doors than it closes. None of this argues for recklessness or manufactured outrage as a strategy. It argues for noticing that safety and invisibility often travel together, and that the person willing to be seen, to take up space, to risk disapproval rather than fade politely into the background, is playing a different game than the one most people default to without ever choosing it. Barnum's more respectable rivals ran quieter shows, and almost none of their names outlasted the century the way his did. Thomas Edison is remembered as the man who invented the light bulb, the phonograph, and dozens of other devices that reshaped daily life. And in the strictest sense, he invented almost none of them alone. Edison ran what amounted to an invention factory in Menlo Park, staffed by skilled engineers, chemists, and mechanics who tested, refined, and frequently solved the technical problems that made his devices actually work. Edison's genius was real, but it was substantially the genius of organization, funding, and, crucially, putting his own name on the patents and the public announcements. The men in his workshop did enormous amounts of the underlying work. History remembers the name on the door. This pattern repeats far beyond invention. Credit, it turns out, tends not to flow toward whoever did the most labor, but toward whoever occupies the most visible position when a project reaches its finish line, and toward whoever controls how the story of that project gets told afterward. A team can do brilliant, difficult, essential work, and if the person presenting it to the world is someone else, the someone else is who gets remembered. There is a harder edge to this worth naming, honestly. It is possible to build an entire career, as some historical figures plainly did, by managing other people's talent rather than possessing much of their own, and letting the credit settle wherever the spotlight happens to fall. Whether that arrangement is fair is a separate question from whether it works, and history is full of quiet, brilliant contributors whose names never made it into the caption under the photograph. Edison held more than 1,000 patents by the end of his life, and most of the hands that built what those patents described belonged to somebody else. There is a small, uncomfortable truth buried in how people value access to other people, that the easier you are to reach, the less reaching you tend to inspire. Wealthy patrons across the courts of Renaissance Italy understood this instinctively. A prince who was always available, who answered every request promptly and welcomed every visitor without friction, quickly became someone people stopped working very hard to impress. A prince who was occasionally, deliberately, unavailable, whose favor had to be earned through patience, introduction, or demonstrated value, became someone worth pursuing, and the pursuit itself did a great deal of the persuading before any actual meeting occurred. The underlying mechanism has nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with how people assign value. Something freely given, without any friction attached, gets treated as ordinary, however genuinely useful it is. Something that requires effort to obtain gets treated as significant, almost regardless of its actual merits, simply because effort was required. This is not really about the object or the person being pursued. It is about what the pursuer had to invest to get there. An investment tends to manufacture its own sense of value after the fact. This does not require anyone to become cold or manipulative in their ordinary relationships. It suggests something gentler, that constant, effortless availability, in work and in life, quietly erodes how much people value your attention, while a reasonable, unforced scarcity restores some of what pure convenience tends to spend down. The busiest courts in history rarely kept an open door, and the doors worth waiting outside of were the ones people remembered. Arguments, however well constructed, tend to provoke a very specific and very unhelpful response in the person listening to them, the instinct to argue back. This is not a flaw in any particular argument. It is closer to a structural feature of arguing itself. The moment a person feels persuaded through logic alone, some part of them notices they have been outmaneuvered intellectually, and that feeling, whether or not it is fair, invites resistance rather than agreement. People do not like losing an argument even when the argument is correct, and they will frequently keep disagreeing well past the point where the evidence has stopped supporting them, purely to avoid the discomfort of conceding. A demonstration works differently. When a result simply happens in front of someone without requiring them to admit defeat in a verbal contest, there is nothing to resist. There was no argument to lose, only an outcome to witness. Engineers, inventors, and generals throughout history have understood this instinctively. Favoring the working model over the persuasive speech, the successful campaign over the pamphlet explaining why it would succeed. A bridge that holds convinces skeptics who no lecture on structural engineering ever could. The practical version of this shows up constantly in ordinary disagreements. Explaining, at length, why an idea will work rarely changes a skeptic's mind nearly as effectively as simply doing the thing and letting them watch it happen. Words invite counterwords. Results, once achieved, have nothing left to counter. The clearest arguments in history were, often enough, the ones nobody ever had to make out loud. Sailors and merchants in earlier centuries held a superstition that sounds, on its surface, almost cruel, to avoid partnering with anyone who seemed to carry bad luck, because it had a habit of spreading to whoever stood nearby. Stripped of the superstition, there is a more practical observation underneath it. People who experience one crisis after another are sometimes simply unlucky in the purest sense, victims of circumstances entirely outside their control. But often, and this is the uncomfortable part, chronic misfortune traces back to patterns of judgment, patterns of relationship, and patterns of behavior that keep producing the same kind of trouble, again and again in slightly different clothing. And behavior, unlike fate, is exactly the kind of thing that rubs off on the people standing closest to it. A business partner who is perpetually in crisis pulls attention, resources, and reputation toward managing their instability rather than toward the shared work at hand. A friend whose life is one emergency after another can drain years of goodwill from people who genuinely care about them, simply because there is always another fire to help put out. None of this is the troubled person's fault in any moral sense, and compassion toward people going through hard times is not the thing being argued against here. The argument is narrower, that sustained, structural instability in someone else's life has a way of becoming a structural instability in yours too, if you stand close enough to it for long enough, and it is worth noticing the difference between a friend having a hard year and a person whose hard years never seem to end. The old traders were never really diagnosing anyone's character, only protecting their own ships from a pattern they had learned. The hard way tends to spread. Gratitude fades faster than most people expect, and history's more careful operators built their security on something they trusted more, being genuinely, structurally necessary. A common pattern among skilled advisors, engineers, and specialists across many eras is a curious reluctance to fully train their own successors, or to document every piece of specialized knowledge in a form anyone else could use. This can look, from the outside, like insecurity or even sabotage. From the inside, it often reflects a clear-eyed understanding of how quickly indispensable people become dispensable the moment someone else can do what they do. Loyalty, once the immediate need that produced it has passed, tends to weaken. Necessity does not, as long as the necessity is real and ongoing. There is a harder edge here worth naming plainly. Deliberately hoarding critical knowledge to make yourself irreplaceable is at bottom a form of self-protection that can shade into something closer to hostage-taking. And organizations that reward this behavior often end up more fragile for it, not less, because critical knowledge concentrated in one anxious person is a risk waiting to surface at the worst possible moment. The strategy protects the individual while quietly endangering everyone around them. Even so, the underlying observation about dependency and security is difficult to argue with. People and institutions consistently treat the irreplaceable with more care, more patience, and more accommodation than they extend to the merely competent, whose absence would barely register. Whether to build genuine indispensability through skill too rare to duplicate or to manufacture it through withheld information is a choice with real consequences either way, and only one of those paths tends to age well. The advisor who never quite finished training a replacement kept his seat, in story after story, far longer than the one who trained his on schedule. People are, on the whole, deeply suspicious of anyone who appears to have no flaws at all, and this suspicion turns out to be one of the easiest things in the world to exploit, for better or worse. A person who admits, briefly and apparently without calculation, to some small weakness, or who offers an unexpected, seemingly unnecessary act of generosity, tends to be trusted far more readily afterward than someone who has never shown a single crack in their polish. The admission or the gesture reads as proof of honesty, evidence that this is a person willing to be vulnerable, willing to give something away without an obvious angle. Once that trust is granted, it tends to extend well beyond the specific moment that earned it, covering areas the person never actually demonstrated any particular honesty about at all. This is precisely why the tactic has such a long, uncomfortable history in the hands of con artists as well as diplomats. A confident trickster who admits, early in an interaction, to some minor and flattering-sounding flaw, disarms the wariness that would otherwise protect their mark through everything that follows. A negotiator who makes one small, visible concession early in a discussion, one that cost relatively little, often earns enough goodwill to secure much larger concessions later, concessions that were never actually connected to the first small gesture in any logical way. The uncomfortable lesson is not that honesty is bad. It is that honesty, deployed selectively and with intent, functions as a tool with real leverage, and the wariness most people reserve for total strangers evaporates remarkably fast in the presence of one well-timed, apparently unguarded moment. The mark who trusted the small, unguarded confession rarely thought to ask why it had been offered at all. Ask for help by describing your own need, and you are relying on someone else's generosity, a resource that varies wildly by mood, by day, and by how much that person happens to like you. Ask for help by describing their advantage, and you are relying on something far steadier, their own self-interest. This distinction has shaped diplomacy for as long as diplomacy has existed. A request framed as pity, no matter how genuine the underlying need, puts the other party in the position of doing you a favor, and favors carry a cost that people are often unconsciously reluctant to pay, especially from a stranger or a rival with no particular emotional stake in your circumstances. A request framed as opportunity, on the other hand, offered as something that serves the listener's own goals, removes the need for generosity altogether. The listener is not doing you a favor. They are making a good decision for themselves that happens to help you too. This shows up constantly outside of formal diplomacy. A colleague asked to help with extra work purely as a personal favor may agree reluctantly, resentfully, or not at all. The same colleague, shown clearly how the extra work will make their own projects succeed, their own reputation stronger, or their own future easier, tends to say yes readily, and often enthusiastically, because the decision now serves them directly rather than merely obliging someone else. None of this requires manipulation or dishonesty. It requires noticing that most people, most of the time, act more reliably from calculated self-interest than from sympathy alone, and framing a request around the first is simply working with human nature rather than hoping to override it. The gratitude was never needed because the advantage had already spoken for itself. The most effective spies across the long history of espionage were rarely the cold, calculating figures of fiction. They were the warm ones, the easy company, the people whose friendship felt entirely genuine, because in most respects it was. Information tends to flow toward whoever seems safest to talk to. A declared rival, a known interrogator, a person whose interests obviously conflict with yours, gets careful, guarded answers, because the danger of the conversation is visible and the guard goes up accordingly. A trusted friend, sharing a drink, asking easy questions out of what looks like ordinary curiosity, gets the unguarded version, the details people never intended to share with anyone at all, offered up simply because the conversation felt safe and the friendship felt real. This is why the most damaging information leaks in history rarely came from formal interrogation. They came from relaxed dinners, casual friendships, and long-standing social ties that never seemed, on their surface, to have anything to do with information gathering at all. The friendship did not have to be entirely false for the tactic to work. Often the warmth was completely genuine, which made the information that flowed alongside it even harder to guard against, because guarding against a real friend feels, to most people, like a kind of betrayal in itself. There is an obvious ethical weight to this pattern worth sitting with, honestly. Using real warmth as a channel for extracting information is, in most ordinary relationships, a serious violation of trust, and the history of espionage is full of friendships that ended in exactly the kind of damage this implies. The tactic works precisely because most people never suspect the people who make them feel most comfortable. The friendliest conversation in the room was not always, it turned out, the safest one to have. There is an old military observation that a commander who is everywhere, constantly visible, constantly available to every soldier's question, gradually stops being seen as a commander at all, and starts being seen as simply another familiar face among many. Distance, used deliberately, produces the opposite effect. A leader who appears rarely at moments that matter, whose presence is felt as significant rather than routine, retains an authority that constant availability slowly erodes. This is partly about mystery, since people fill the gaps in what they do not see with a certain amount of assumed importance, and partly about simple psychology, because familiarity, however comfortable, breeds a kind of casualness that authority struggles to survive. Courts, armies, and even modern organizations show the same pattern repeatedly. The executive, who is always in every single, always reachable, always present, eventually finds their opinions carrying less weight than the one who appears only when the matter genuinely requires it, and whose scarcity has quietly signaled that their time, and by extension their judgment, is worth more. This does not argue for coldness or unavailability as a permanent state, which tends to curdle into simple absence and eventually irrelevance of a different kind. It argues for noticing that constant presence has a cost that rarely gets tallied honestly, a slow erosion of the very weight that made the presence valuable in the first place. The general who occasionally stepped back from the front lines kept an authority that the general who never once left it was quietly losing every day. A person whose reactions can be predicted with confidence is, whether they realize it or not, a person who has handed everyone around them a kind of instruction manual for managing and occasionally manipulating them. Rulers who understood this across many eras deliberately avoided becoming predictable, even to their closest advisors. A minister who could reliably guess how the ruler would respond to bad news, to a request, or to a rival's provocation, could plan around that response, prepare for it, and eventually learn to steer it. A ruler whose responses varied, who might be lenient one week and severe the next, without any obvious pattern connecting the two, denied everyone around them that same planning advantage. Caution, in the presence of genuine unpredictability, tends to replace the confidence that comes from thinking you already know how someone will react. This carries an obvious cost worth naming honestly. Genuine unpredictability in personal relationships, the kind driven by real instability rather than strategy, damages trust and exhausts the people around it. And there is a meaningful difference between calculated variation and simple erratic behavior, even if they can look similar from a distance. The strategic version requires enough underlying consistency of character that people still trust the relationship overall. What varies is the specific response, not the fundamental person. Used carefully, this small unpredictability keeps advisors, rivals, and even allies slightly more careful, slightly less presumptuous, and slightly less inclined to test limits they cannot confidently predict the shape of. No one plots carefully against a reaction they cannot reliably guess in advance. The instinct to withdraw, to build walls both literal and social against a world that feels dangerous, is one of the oldest and most understandable responses to threat. It is also, across a remarkable amount of history, one of the more reliable ways to accelerate exactly the downfall it was meant to prevent. A ruler surrounded by court intrigue might reasonably conclude that the safest response is distance, fewer advisors, fewer visitors, fewer people close enough to do harm. But every one of those relationships, however risky, was also a channel of information, a way of knowing what rivals were actually planning, what the mood of the court actually was, what threats were real and which were simply rumor. Cut off from all of it, a ruler does not become safer. They become blind, and blindness in a position of power is its own, often far more dangerous, kind of vulnerability. History offers repeated versions of this pattern. A leader retreats into a smaller and smaller circle of trusted confidants, cutting off outside perspective in the name of security, and the resulting isolation lets a genuine threat develop entirely unnoticed, precisely because there was no longer anyone positioned or willing to bring bad news through the narrowing gate. The fortress meant to keep danger out ends up keeping information out along with it. The steadier approach, harder to maintain than it sounds, is engagement managed carefully rather than abandoned altogether, staying connected enough to see what is actually happening, while being selective about who gets close enough to act on it. The tower built for safety, in story after story, turned out to be exactly where the danger finally arrived unseen. A joke that charms one person can deeply offend another. A generous gesture that touches one recipient can insult a different one entirely, who reads generosity as condescension. None of history's supposed rules for influencing people work uniformly because people are not uniform, and the diplomats who succeeded most consistently were rarely the ones with the cleverest single technique. They were the ones who paid the closest attention to who exactly they were dealing with before choosing any technique at all. Some people respond to flattery, others find flattery instantly suspicious and respond far better to blunt honesty. Some people are moved by appeals to their self-interest. Others, insulted by the suggestion that self-interest is what motivates them, respond only to appeals framed around principle or loyalty. Applying the wrong approach to the wrong temperament does not merely fail to help. It often actively damages the relationship because the mismatch itself, the sense of being misread, registers as a kind of disrespect. This is, in a sense, the quiet exception underneath every other law on this list. Concealing intentions works beautifully on some people and reads as obvious evasion to others who are naturally suspicious. Court attention delights some audiences and repels others who value discretion above almost everything. No tactic here is universal, and the diplomats and courtiers who lasted the longest were the ones who understood this distinction before applying any of the rest. Reading the person correctly before choosing what to do about them turns out to be the harder and far more valuable skill, the one all the other skills quietly depend on. The gift that charmed one court insulted the next, and the difference was never really about the gift. There is a particular kind of survivor who shows up throughout political history, present at every regime change, useful to every new administration, somehow never quite ruined by the fall of the previous one. The common thread among them is rarely brilliance. It is usually the simple fact that they never fully committed to any single faction in the first place. Full commitment to one side of a conflict offers real benefits when that side wins, and total ruin when it loses. The The person who avoids that binary choice, who maintains just enough distance from every faction to remain valuable to all of them, trades the occasional big win for a much steadier kind of security. When one side falls, they are still useful to whoever rises in its place, because they were never quite an enemy of the winners, and never quite fully an ally of the losers either. This carries a real cost in trust. Factions on every side tend to sense correctly that an uncommitted party's loyalty is conditional, and conditional loyalty earns less warmth, fewer favors, and less genuine intimacy than the wholehearted kind. The uncommitted survivor is rarely beloved. They are simply, reliably, still standing after everyone who committed fully to one side or the other has already gone down with it. Whether this trade is worth making depends entirely on what a person actually wants: the deeper rewards of full alliance with its real risk attached, or the steadier, lonelier security of belonging fully to no one. The courtier who outlasted 6 regimes was rarely Enion's closest friend, and rarely, for that same reason, Enion's ruined enemy either. Nobody feels the need to defend carefully against an opponent they believe they have already outsmarted, and this single piece of human vanity has quietly funded an enormous amount of history's fraud. The classic confidence trick depends on precisely this dynamic. The con artist plays slightly slow, slightly naive, slightly out of their depth, and the mark, feeling clever by comparison, relaxes exactly the wariness that would otherwise protect them. The sense of being the smarter person in the exchange is intoxicating enough that people routinely lower their guard around anyone who seems to confirm it, walking straight into the trap their own vanity had already half built for them. This dynamic extends well past outright fraud into the more ordinary territory of negotiation and rivalry. A negotiator who lets the other side believe they have the intellectual upper hand often extracts far better terms than one who insists on demonstrating superior cleverness at every turn, because the party who feels they have already won the mental contest stops negotiating as carefully as they should. Underestimation, it turns out, is a genuine strategic advantage, precisely because it invites carelessness in whoever is doing the underestimating. There is an obvious limit to how far this should be pushed in good faith relationships, where deliberately deceiving someone about your own capability for personal gain shades quickly into the exact kind of fraud the tactic was named for. Used with restraint, though, in negotiation or ordinary self-protection, letting other people feel a little smarter than you costs almost nothing and has brought a remarkable number of advantages throughout history that a display of obvious brilliance would have made immediately impossible. The mark who believed he had outwitted the con man never once suspected that the belief itself was the entire trick. Resistance meets resistance. This is one of the more reliable patterns in human conflict, and it explains why the person who fights back hardest against an aggressor often ends up in the worst position of all, having escalated a confrontation that a different response might have quietly ended. Strategic surrender works by removing the thing an aggressor actually needs to keep escalating, a target that keeps pushing back. An opponent who visibly yields, who appears to concede rather than fight, denies the aggressor the resistance that justified further force in the first place. Without resistance to overcome, aggression frequently loses its own momentum, and a conflict that might have destroyed both parties instead dissolves, one side having apparently lost while actually losing very little at all. This is not the same as genuine helplessness, and the distinction matters. Genuine weakness invites further exploitation, because there is nothing left to fear from continuing the attack. Strategic surrender is closer to a controlled release of tension at the exact moment it is needed, a deliberate choice made from a position that still retains real options, offered specifically because it serves the yielding party's actual interests better than continued conflict would have. The aggressor believes they have won. The person who yielded has, in fact, ended the confrontation on their own terms, having lost the least amount possible. This has obvious limits. Yielding to a genuinely dangerous ongoing threat is not strategy, it is simply danger, and knowing the difference matters more than the tactic itself. But in ordinary disputes, workplace conflicts, and negotiations that threaten to spiral, a well-timed concession has ended more fights than an equally well-timed show of strength ever has. The one who yielded first, in more than a few old accounts, turned out to have lost the least. Spread an army thin across too many fronts, and it becomes weak everywhere at once, vulnerable to a concentrated opponent who has chosen correctly to commit everything to a single decisive point rather than dividing their own strength to match. This principle of concentrated force has shaped military thinking for centuries, from ancient campaigns to more recent conflicts, and the underlying math never really changes. A smaller force applied entirely to one target frequently overwhelms a larger force divided across several, because divided strength is, at the moment of any single engagement, effectively weaker than its total size suggests. Generals who understood this consistently outperformed generals who tried to hold every position at once, defending everything and therefore defending nothing especially well. The same principle translates, almost without modification, into ordinary ambition. A person pursuing 5 different goals simultaneously, spreading modest effort across each one, routinely accomplishes less than a person who commits the same total effort entirely to a single goal, because effort divided across many fronts rarely reaches the threshold needed to actually break through on any of them. Half-hearted progress on several projects tends in total less than full-hearted progress on one. This is genuinely difficult advice to follow, since abandoning some ambitions to fully fund a single one requires a kind of discipline that feels, in the moment, like giving something up. But history's most decisive victories, on battlefields and off them, rarely belong to whoever tried hardest to do everything. They belong to whoever chose deliberately to do one thing completely. The army that held every border, thinly lost, again and again, to the one that broke through decisively at a single point, and never looked back. Royal courts across history rewarded a very specific kind of talent that had almost nothing to do with the talent a person might have arrived with. What mattered was the ability to read a room accurately, to sense whose ego needed managing, whose temper needed avoiding, and whose favor needed cultivating, all while appearing to do none of it deliberately. The perfect courtier, as history's more successful ones demonstrated, was rarely the most brilliant person present. They were the most socially attuned, capable of complimenting a rival without seeming to flatter, deferring to a superior without seeming servile, and navigating a room full of competing egos without ever appearing to navigate anything at all. This skill was invisible by design. A courtier who was visibly working the room lost the very effect the skill was meant to produce, since visible effort at social management reads, to a wary audience, as manipulation rather than grace. What made this genuinely difficult was the constant recalibration it demanded. The behavior that charmed one nobleman offended another. The joke that landed well at one gathering fell flat, or worse, at the next. Successful courtiers were, in effect, running a continuous, exhausting assessment of the social terrain around them, adjusting constantly, and making it all look effortless. This translates surprisingly directly into modern office life, where the person who advances is rarely the most technically skilled, but often the one who manages relationships, egos, and unspoken tensions most gracefully. The talent looks like nothing at all, right up until the moment someone tries and fails to imitate it. The courtiers remembered decades later were rarely praised for one brilliant achievement, but for never once making anyone in the room uncomfortable. Most people allow their public identity to form by accident, shaped by circumstance, habit, and whatever impression happened to stick early on. A smaller number of historical figures took the opposite approach, treating their own image as something to be built deliberately, the way an architect builds a building, and revised whenever the old version stopped serving them. This is different from simple dishonesty. It is closer to recognizing that other people relate to a version of you, a set of impressions and associations, rather than to the full private complexity no outsider could ever fully access anyway. Since that public version exists regardless, the choice is only ever between shaping it deliberately or leaving it to whatever impression happened to form first, often based on circumstances that no longer apply. Figures who reinvented themselves successfully across politics, business, and the arts tended to do so at moments when their old identity had become a liability, a role too small for what they had become, or too tied to a past failure to carry them into whatever came next. The reinvention was rarely about becoming a different person underneath. It was about presenting a different, deliberately chosen surface, one built to match the ambitions of the present rather than the accidents of the past. There is a real risk of exhaustion in living this way, treating identity as a constant construction project rather than something to simply inhabit. But for people whose old image has genuinely stopped fitting, the alternative, staying trapped inside an identity built by accident years earlier, tends to cost far more than the discomfort of choosing a new one. The self-history remembered was, for more than one of these figures, the third or fourth version they had built, never the first. A decision and the person who visibly carries it out are not, in the eyes of most observers, quite the same thing, and rulers throughout history exploited this gap with considerable skill. An unpopular tax, a harsh punishment, an unwelcome policy all needed to be enacted, but the ruler who ordered it and the minister who announced it absorbed very different amounts of public anger for the same underlying decision. The minister, standing visibly at the point of impact, became the face of the grievance. The ruler, one step removed, often escaped the worst of the resentment entirely, and could even step in later, apparently sympathetic, to soften or reverse the minister's harsh policy, earning gratitude for undoing a decision they had quietly ordered in the first place. This works because blame attaches most strongly to whoever is visibly, proximately responsible at the moment of harm, rather than to whoever actually made the underlying decision further back in the chain. A person insulated from that visible moment, even while directing everything from behind it, tends to escape a disproportionate share of the consequences, while someone else absorbs the damage on their behalf, whether that someone else fully understood the arrangement or not. There is an obvious moral weight to this pattern that deserves naming honestly. Using other people to absorb consequences for decisions you made, without their full knowledge of the arrangement, treats them as a kind of shield rather than a colleague. And the ministers who served this function throughout history rarely benefited nearly as much as the rulers who arranged it. The crown across story after story stayed remarkably clean, while the hands doing the actual work rarely did. People do not primarily join movements because they have been persuaded by evidence. They join because the movement offers something they were already missing: belonging, meaning, or a clear sense of who the enemy is and who the friends are, in a world that otherwise felt confusing and unstructured. Leaders who built lasting followings throughout history understood this instinctively, even without articulating it in these terms. They spent far less energy on logical argument than on satisfying an emotional need their followers already carried, whether that need was for community, for purpose, for a sense of specialness in being among the chosen few who truly understood, or simply for someone to blame for a life that had gone wrong through no clear fault of their own. Once that need was met, evidence and argument became almost beside the point. A person whose deepest emotional needs are being satisfied by a belief system rarely abandons it over a fact that contradicts it. They simply find a reason the fact does not apply. This is precisely why movements built on genuine belief, rather than mere persuasion, prove so remarkably durable in the face of contradicting information, and why rational argument so often fails to talk anyone out of a commitment that was never primarily rational to begin with. The belief was doing a job. Facts rarely compete successfully with a job well done. There is an obvious danger folded into this observation, since the same mechanism that builds a healthy sense of community can just as easily be exploited by leaders with far less benign intentions, offering belonging as bait for control. Understanding how the mechanism works is protection against it, whichever direction it is being used in. The strongest followings in history were built less on the best arguments than on the most accurately identified needs. A hesitant attempt at almost anything tends to fail in a very particular way, not because the underlying idea was wrong, but because the visible uncertainty behind the attempt undermined it before it had a real chance to succeed. This shows up across history in military campaigns, negotiations, and public performances alike. A general who commits half-heartedly to an attack, testing the waters rather than pressing forward decisively, often loses to a smaller force that commits fully and without visible doubt, because hesitation communicates weakness to everyone watching, allies and enemies alike, and that perceived weakness invites exactly the kind of resistance a bold, fully committed action tends to bypass. The psychology underneath this is fairly simple once named. People take their cues about how seriously to treat a situation from how seriously the person acting appears to be treating it themselves. A tentative request gets a tentative response. A confident, fully committed action gets treated, more often than not, as though it deserves to succeed, purely because it was presented that way. This is not magic. It is simply that hesitation invites scrutiny and pushback in a way that decisive commitment tends to short-circuit before it has time to organize. None of this argues for recklessness or for boldness applied to plans that genuinely deserve more caution. It argues for noticing that once a plan has actually been chosen, half-hearted execution frequently produces worse outcomes than full commitment to the exact same plan, because the hesitation itself becomes part of what fails. The commanders remembered as bold were rarely remembered for the plans they chose, but for how completely they committed once the choosing was done. Winning a battle and knowing what to do the morning after are two entirely different skills, and history is full of leaders who mastered the first and never bothered to develop the second, with consequences that sometimes undid the victory entirely. A campaign fought without any real plan for its aftermath, for how to govern a conquered territory, how to manage a defeated rival, or how to handle the power vacuum left behind by a removed opponent, frequently produces chaos that costs more than the original problem the campaign was meant to solve. The victory, in the moment, looks complete. The consequences, unanticipated because nobody planned for them, arrive later and often prove far harder to manage than the original conflict ever was. This pattern is not unique to warfare. A person who fights hard to win a promotion, a public argument, or a competitive advantage, without ever considering what they will actually do once they have won it, or how the people they defeated along the way will behave afterward, often finds the victory hollow, or worse, actively costly, precisely because all the planning stopped at the moment of triumph rather than continuing past it. The discipline being described here is uncomfortable because it requires imagining success in enough detail to plan for its complications, at a moment when most people are focused entirely on whether success will happen at all. But the leaders and strategists whose victories actually lasted were, almost without exception, the ones who had already thought several steps past the finish line, before the race had even started. The empire that conquered widely without a plan for what came next often spent more managing the aftermath than it had ever spent conquering. There is a strange but consistent rule about how people judge skill. The harder something visibly looks, the more impressive the attempt seems, but the more effortless a finished result appears, the more masterful the person behind it seems, and these two judgments run in almost opposite directions. Renaissance painters, trained for years in workshops before ever selling a single independent piece, learned to conceal every trace of the labor, the failed studies, the corrected mistakes, the sheer accumulated hours, behind a finished canvas that appeared to have simply happened, as though the artist's hand had moved with total ease from the very first stroke. Audiences who saw the finished work rarely saw the years behind it, and this was entirely by design. Visible struggle in the final product reads as amateurish, its complete absence reads as genius. This principle extends well beyond painting. A speaker who delivers a complex idea in simple, apparently unrehearsed language is judged as more brilliant than one who visibly struggles through the same material, even when the second speaker's underlying understanding is deeper. An athlete who makes a difficult movement look easy earns more admiration than one who visibly strains through the same feat, regardless of which one actually performed it better by any objective measure. The effort is real in both cases, only one of them chose to hide it. This creates a genuine tension for anyone learning a difficult skill, since the natural instinct is to show how hard you are working, hoping the effort itself earns credit. History suggests the opposite tends to be true. Credit flows toward whoever makes the difficult look inevitable, not toward whoever makes the difficulty visible. The paintings that looked as though they had taken no effort at all were, without exception, the ones that had taken the most. An unusually generous offer, arriving with no obvious catch attached, has made fools of a remarkable number of otherwise careful people throughout history, precisely because the absence of a visible cost feels, in the moment, like pure good fortune rather than what it usually is, a cost that has simply been hidden or postponed. Merchants who survived long careers in unpredictable markets developed a healthy suspicion of exactly this pattern. A deal too generous to make obvious sense either concealed some flaw in the goods, some obligation attached quietly to accepting it, or some later demand for reciprocity far larger than the original gift. The wisdom that developed around this was blunt: pay the fair price, visibly and completely, and you retain independence. Accept the free gift, and you have usually just taken on a debt whose terms have not yet been disclosed to you. This shows up constantly outside of trade. A favor accepted without any clear exchange often comes with an unspoken expectation of return, sometimes far larger than the original favor, and the person who accepted it, having enjoyed something for nothing, frequently finds themselves later obligated in ways that feel impossible to refuse gracefully. The clean, paid-for transaction, however less flattering it feels in the moment, carries none of this hidden weight. None of this argues against genuine generosity between people who trust each other completely, where gifts really are simply gifts. It argues for noticing that in transactions between parties without that trust, an unusually generous offer deserves more scrutiny, not less, than an ordinary, fairly priced one. The gift that cost nothing at the moment it was given rarely, in the old merchant's experience, stayed free for very long. The easiest way to control a decision is rarely to argue forcefully for a single preferred outcome. It is to shape, quietly, the entire menu of choices the other person believes they have available to them, so that whichever one they pick was already the one you wanted. A skilled negotiator, rather than pushing hard for their favored result and inviting resistance, often presents 2 or 3 carefully chosen alternatives, each of which happens to serve their own interests reasonably well, and lets the other party feel the satisfaction of choosing freely among them. The choice feels autonomous. It was, in fact, engineered well before the conversation ever started, by whoever decided which options would appear on the table in the first place, and which ones would never be mentioned at all. This tactic depends on a simple but reliable feature of how people make decisions. Most people evaluate the choices actually in front of them, rather than searching independently for alternatives nobody has raised, especially under time pressure or social pressure to decide quickly. Whoever sets the menu, in effect, has already won most of the negotiation before any actual choosing takes place, because the strongest possible alternative for the other side, the one they might have preferred above every option offered, was simply never put in front of them. This can be used with real integrity, offering only choices that genuinely serve both parties well, or with considerably less integrity, quietly excluding the options that would have served the other party best. Either way, the underlying mechanism is the same, and understanding it is the surest protection against being maneuvered by it. The negotiation that felt entirely fair to both sides had often already been decided by whoever wrote the menu. Truth, stated plainly, competes badly against a good story, especially when the story offers something the listener already, secretly, wanted to believe about themselves or their future. Traveling con artists across many centuries built entire careers on this observation. The victim of a classic fraud was rarely a fool in any general sense. They were, more precisely, a person offered a story that matched a fantasy they already carried, a chance at sudden wealth, a secret opportunity available only to the specially chosen, a shortcut around the slow, unglamorous work everyone else was doing. The fraud succeeded not by being especially clever in its mechanics, but by being emotionally accurate about what the mark already wished were true. This mechanism extends well past outright fraud. Advertising, political rhetoric, and ordinary persuasion all lean on the same underlying pattern, offering a vision of a better, more special, more deserving version of the listener's own life, rather than simply presenting facts and letting the facts do the persuading on their own. Facts, on their own, rarely move anyone as effectively as a story that lets a person imagine themselves as the hero of it. There is an obvious ethical line here that separates storytelling from fraud, and it runs roughly along the question of whether the fantasy being offered can actually be delivered. A story that inspires someone toward a genuinely achievable goal is simply good persuasion. A story that offers a fantasy with no real path to delivering it is the exact mechanism every historical con has ever relied on. The people who lost the most were rarely the least intelligent in the room, only the ones whose private fantasy had been read most accurately. Everyone, according to a long tradition of court advisors and negotiators, carries one specific vulnerability that matters more to them than any general argument ever could, a fear they have not named out loud, an insecurity they have spent years hiding, or a desire so specific that ordinary persuasion never gets close to it. Find that influence becomes far easier than any broad rhetorical appeal ever managed. This idea shows up across an enormous range of historical contexts, from courtiers who studied a monarch's specific insecurities to negotiators who researched a rival's particular pride points before ever sitting down at the table. The observation being made is not that people are simple or predictable in general. It is the opposite, that people are so specifically, individually vulnerable in one particular place that generic tactics, however well designed, tend to slide off them, while an approach tailored to that one precise point lands with disproportionate force. There is a genuinely uncomfortable side to this worth naming clearly. Identifying someone's specific insecurity in order to exploit it is manipulation in its most direct form, and the historical record includes plenty of court advisors who used exactly this knowledge to devastating effect against people who never suspected their private vulnerability had been so precisely mapped. The same knowledge, though, used with actual care rather than exploitation, is close to what a good friend or a good teacher does naturally, paying enough attention to someone to understand what genuinely moves them, and meeting them there, rather than with a generic approach that misses the point entirely. The tool and the kindness require exactly the same underlying skill, and only the intention afterward tells them apart. The courtier who understood the king's hidden fear held more real power in that court than anyone carrying a formal title. Rank, in most societies throughout history, has been at least partly a performance, and the performance mattered nearly as much as the formal title behind it. A person who carried themselves with quiet, unhurried self-assurance, regardless of their actual position, was routinely treated with a deference that people of genuinely higher rank, but visibly anxious or apologetic bearing, never quite managed to earn. This is not simply about confidence in the vague, motivational sense the word usually gets used in. It is closer to a specific, learnable quality, an unhurried manner, a steadiness under pressure, a refusal to grovel or over-explain, all of which signal, to everyone watching, that this is a person who does not need anyone else's approval quite as badly as most people seem to. Observers, consciously or not, read that lack of visible need as a kind of status in itself, and treat the person accordingly, often before learning anything about their actual position. Historical figures who rose from humble origins to genuine influence frequently shared this trait before they had any formal claim to the treatment it earned them. They carried themselves as though they already belonged in rooms they had not yet been formally invited into, and remarkably often, the rooms adjusted to match the bearing rather than the other way around. This is not a suggestion to fake status a person does not have, which tends to collapse under scrutiny the moment it is tested. It points towards something narrower, that self-possession, calm and unhurried regardless of actual rank, changes how a room responds, in ways that formal titles alone rarely manage on their own. The bearing came first, in case after historical case, and the formal recognition, when it arrived at all, came quietly afterward. An idea can be exactly right and still fail completely, simply because it arrived at the wrong moment, in front of an audience not yet ready to hear it, worried about something else entirely, or still emotionally attached to whatever the idea was proposing to replace. History offers plenty of proposals, reforms, and inventions that were rejected outright the first time they were seriously proposed, only to be adopted, sometimes by the very same institutions, once circumstances shifted enough to make the timing right. The idea itself rarely changed in the interval. What changed was the readiness of the audience, the absence of a crisis that had previously made change feel too risky, or the presence of a new crisis that suddenly made the old proposal feel urgent rather than reckless. The uncomfortable lesson buried in this pattern is that persistence, pushed against bad timing, often accomplishes less than patience, waiting for good timing to arrive on its own. A person convinced their idea is correct, understandably, wants to press forward immediately, and mistaking the rejection of bad timing for the rejection of the idea itself, keeps pushing at exactly the moment when pushing harder only produces more resistance. The same idea, shelved patiently and reintroduced later when circumstances have shifted, can succeed with startlingly little additional effort. This requires a discipline that comes easily to almost no one, recognizing the difference between an idea that failed and an idea that simply arrived too early, and having the patience to wait for a moment that cannot be forced into existence by sheer determination. The proposal rejected outright in one decade was adopted, almost word for word, in the next, and no one in the room seemed to remember it had ever been turned away. Wanting something visibly, and not getting it, costs a person twice, once in the disappointment itself, and again in the loss of standing that comes from having been seen to want, and fail to get, something everyone watched them chase. Figures who managed public reputation carefully across history developed a specific discipline around this. The moment something became clearly unattainable, a title denied, a position given to someone else, a person who would not return their affection, they stopped visibly wanting it immediately and completely, at least in any way anyone else could observe. The desire may well have continued privately. Publicly, it vanished, replaced by an apparent indifference that read, to a watching, as strength rather than loss. This matters because continued visible longing for something already denied signals, to anyone watching, a kind of ongoing defeat, a person still losing repeatedly in front of an audience. Studied indifference, whether or not it is entirely genuine, ends that visible defeat immediately. It also, curiously, sometimes recovers the original opportunity, since people and institutions are drawn toward whoever appears unaffected by rejection and repelled by whoever appears to be dwelling in it. The prize that was denied to the visibly desperate pursuer occasionally finds its way back to the person who appeared, convincingly, to have already moved on. None of this requires suppressing real feeling in private, which tends to cause its own damage over time. It suggests a narrower discipline, keeping visible reactions separate from private ones, so that a public loss does not compound itself into a longer, more visible pattern of loss that costs standing long after the original disappointment has actually faded. The figures remembered as gracious in defeat were rarely people who decided, carefully, what the room was allowed to see. A coronation, a triumphal procession, an elaborately staged execution. None of these events existed primarily to accomplish a practical task that could not have been handled more quietly and efficiently. They existed because rulers throughout history understood something about how legitimacy actually gets communicated to a crowd that cannot read a legal document and would not be persuaded by one even if they could. Spectacle bypasses argument entirely. A carefully staged procession, full of color, scale, and ceremony, communicates power directly to the senses, in a way that requires no literacy, no careful reasoning, and no willingness to be persuaded by words. The crowd watching simply feels the presence of something significant, and that feeling, unmediated by argument, often proves more durable and more convincing than any explanation could have been. This is precisely why rulers whose actual claim to authority was shaky often invested the most heavily in visible spectacle, since spectacle could manufacture a sense of legitimacy that argument alone could never quite establish. This principle survives well past monarchy. Modern institutions still stage ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, elaborate product launches, formal inaugurations, not because the underlying business could not be conducted more efficiently in a memo, but because the theatre itself communicates significance in a way that efficiency never manages to. People remember the spectacle. They rarely remember the memo at all. There is a real risk in relying entirely on spectacle without substance behind it eventually, since a crowd that discovers the theatre was covering for an empty claim tends to turn against the theatre itself with unusual bitterness. Used honestly, though, alongside genuine substance, spectacle remains one of history's most reliable tools for making power feel real to the people who are meant to accept it. The empire's actual laws rarely moved a crowd the way the procession through its capital almost always did. An idea that threatens the existing order faces far less resistance when it arrives wrapped in ordinary, unthreatening behavior than when it arrives alongside a person who also dresses strangely, speaks unusually, and generally advertises, through every visible signal, just how different they consider themselves to be. Many of history's genuinely original thinkers understood this distinction and acted on it deliberately. They held ideas that, if fully understood by the people around them, would have been considered dangerous, even heretical, and yet they moved through daily life dressed conventionally, speaking in familiar patterns, attending the expected social functions, giving almost no outward signal that anything unusual was happening beneath the surface. This was not cowardice in most cases, but a kind of practical protection. A radical idea, delivered by someone who otherwise looks and behaves exactly like everyone else, gets evaluated on its own terms. The same idea, delivered by someone visibly performing their own difference, gets dismissed before it is even properly heard, filed away as the eccentricity of an eccentric person, rather than considered seriously. The discomfort in this arrangement is real. It requires living to some degree a divided life, holding genuinely unconventional beliefs privately while presenting a conventional surface publicly, and some thinkers found this divide corrosive over time, a constant low-grade performance that never quite let them be fully seen. Others treated it simply as the entrance fee for being taken seriously enough to eventually be heard at all. Whichever way a person weighs that trade, the historical pattern holds up consistently. That unconventional ideas traveled furthest when they were carried by people who otherwise looked entirely unremarkable. The most dangerous minds of several centuries often looked, from across the room, like the least dangerous people in it. A calm person, fully composed, gives almost nothing away. Their true priorities, fears and weak points stay carefully hidden behind a controlled surface that reveals only what they intend to reveal, which is rarely very much at all. Skilled interrogators and negotiators across history developed a specific counter to this problem to introduce a small, deliberate disturbance, an unexpected question, a mild provocation, a piece of information dropped casually into the conversation, and watch what surfaces in the moment of disruption. A composed opponent, briefly unsettled, often reveals through a flicker of expression, a defensive answer, or a too-quick denial, exactly the thing they had been most carefully guarding, precisely because the disturbance caught them before their usual composure had time to reassert itself. This works because composure is, in most people, a maintained effort rather than a natural resting state, and maintained efforts have small, exploitable gaps whenever something unexpected interrupts them. The provocation does not need to be dramatic. Often the smallest, most casual disruption produces the clearest reaction, precisely because it seems too minor to have been a deliberate tactic, and the opponent's guard was aimed at something larger and more obvious. There is an obvious ethical caution worth naming here, since deliberately unsettling someone to extract information they would not otherwise share edges quickly toward manipulation, and the line between a legitimate negotiating tactic and a genuinely unfair one is not always clear in the moment. Used with restraint and honesty of purpose, though, a small, well-placed disruption remains one of the oldest tools for learning what calm composure was specifically built to hide. The negotiator's most useful question was rarely the largest one in the room, only the small, almost throwaway one nobody had prepared an answer for. There is a specific, largely unearned kind of failure reserved for whoever follows immediately after a truly towering figure, a failure that has very little to do with their own competence and almost everything to do with the comparisons everyone around them cannot help making. History offers repeated examples of capable, sometimes genuinely excellent successors who took over from an especially beloved or accomplished predecessor, only to be judged, almost immediately and almost unanimously, as a disappointment, regardless of what they actually achieved. The comparison itself, not the successor's real performance, produced the verdict. Whatever they did well got measured against an idealized, often exaggerated memory of the person who came before, and whatever they did differently got treated as evidence of decline rather than simply as a different, equally valid approach. The strategic lesson embedded in this pattern is uncomfortable but fairly clear, that following immediately after a legend is one of the worst positions a career can occupy, regardless of talent, because the comparison is nearly impossible to win. The better position, when it can be arranged, is the one after that, once the immediate, unfavorable comparison has already been absorbed by someone else, and a new leader can be judged on their own terms rather than as a disappointing echo of someone unforgettable. This is rarely a choice anyone gets to make freely, since career timing depends on far more than personal strategy. But for those who do have some choice in the matter, waiting out the immediate aftermath of a legendary predecessor, rather than stepping directly into the impossible comparison, has spared a remarkable number of careers from a verdict that was never really about them at all. The second successor, judged at last on his own merits, often succeeded where the first, measured unfairly against a ghost, never really had the chance to. A large, organized force, no matter how formidable it appears from the outside, is frequently held together by something far more fragile than its size suggests, a single point of leadership, coordination, or morale that, if removed, leaves the rest of the structure without any clear way to keep functioning as a unified whole. Military strategists across many centuries understood this and targeted commanders specifically, rather than trying to defeat entire armies soldier by soldier, because a leaderless force, even a very large one, tends to fragment into confusion, competing factions, and eventually retreat in a way that a well-led force, even a much smaller one, almost never does. The soldiers had not necessarily changed their minds about the cause they were fighting for. They had simply lost the single coordinating point that had been organizing their courage and their strategy, and, without it, the group's collective strength dissolved far faster than any individual soldier's resolve would have. This principle extends well past warfare into any organized group, business, political movement, or social structure built around a central figure or a small coordinating group. Removing that specific point of leadership, rather than trying to argue with or defeat every individual member separately, produces a disproportionate collapse, because the structure's real strength was never distributed evenly across its members. It was concentrated in whoever, or whatever, was holding the coordination together. There is an obvious ethical weight in applying this insight to human organizations built around genuine belief rather than mere obedience, and the tactic has been used for both defensible and deeply troubling purposes throughout history. Understanding how concentrated a group's real strength usually is, though, remains useful regardless of which side of that line a person happens to be standing on. The largest armies in history rarely fell soldier by soldier, but from the top, almost every time. Logic rarely changes anyone's mind on its own. However uncomfortable that fact is for anyone who has ever tried to win an argument with a careful, well-reasoned case and watched it fail anyway against an opponent who simply felt more strongly about the matter. The most effective persuaders throughout history, across politics, religion, and commerce, understood something that pure logic tends to overlook, that people generally decide first, at an emotional level, whether they want a given conclusion to be true, and only afterward go looking for the reasoning that justifies the decision they had already quietly made. Address the feeling first, and the reasoning tends to follow along afterward, supplied willingly by the audience's own mind, eager to justify a conclusion it already wants. Address only the reasoning, skipping the feeling entirely, and even flawless logic frequently fails to move anyone who was not already emotionally inclined to accept it. This explains why history's most persuasive speeches leaned so heavily on story, imagery, and appeals to shared identity or fear or hope, rather than on dense argument alone, and why the driest, most technically correct presentation of facts so often failed to change a single mind in the room, however unassailable the facts actually were. The audience needed to feel something first. The facts, offered without that emotional entry point, simply had nowhere to land. There is a real danger here worth acknowledging honestly, since this exact mechanism is precisely what propaganda has always relied on, bypassing careful reasoning by moving feeling first and skipping the scrutiny that slower, fact-based persuasion would otherwise have invited. The same tool serves both honest persuasion and outright deception, and the audience rarely notices the difference from the inside. The speech remembered a century later was almost never the one with the most footnotes attached to it. There is a particular discomfort that comes from watching your own behavior reflected back at you, calmly and without comment, and it tends to unsettle people far more deeply than being directly criticized for the same behavior ever manages to. Diplomats and negotiators throughout history have used a version of this tactic deliberately. Faced with an aggressive, unreasonable, or manipulative counterpart, rather than arguing directly against the behavior, they simply match it, calmly and precisely, reflecting the same tone, the same demands, or the same tactics back at the person using them, without any accompanying accusation or complaint. The aggressor, confronted with an accurate mirror of their own conduct rather than a defensive counter-argument, infrequently finds themselves disarmed in a way that direct confrontation never achieves, because there is nothing to argue against. Their own behavior has simply been returned to them, unchanged, and the discomfort of seeing it clearly does the work that argument could not. This tactic requires considerable discipline, since the natural instinct when facing unreasonable behavior is to explain, defend, or push back directly, all of which give the aggressor something concrete to react against and escalate further. Mirroring offers nothing to escalate against. It simply holds up an accurate reflection and waits, and the silence that follows often accomplishes more than an entire argument would have. There is a version of this that shades into genuine manipulation, using mirrored behavior purely to unsettle rather than to communicate anything true, and the line between an honest reflection and a manipulative trick depends entirely on whether the mirror is accurate. The counterpart who saw their own tactics reflected back at them, without a single word of complaint, often abandoned those tactics faster than any direct objection ever managed to persuade them to. People resist sudden change far more fiercely than they resist the same change delivered slowly, even when the eventual destination is identical, because fear of the unfamiliar, not disagreement with the specific policy, is usually what drives the resistance in the first place. Reformers throughout history who announced sweeping, immediate transformation, however genuinely beneficial the changes might have been, frequently triggered a level of panic and organized opposition that made the reform far harder to actually implement than a slower, quieter version of the exact same goal would have. The public did not necessarily object to where the reform was heading. They objected to how fast the ground seemed to be shifting beneath them, and that objection, driven by fear rather than analysis, proved remarkably difficult to argue away with facts about how beneficial the change would eventually turn out to be. The more successful reformers, by contrast, often preserved familiar names, familiar rituals, and familiar structures, while quietly changing what those structures actually did underneath the surface, letting people adjust to new substance without feeling as though everything familiar had been swept away at once. The change arrived just as completely, eventually, that it never attracted the same fearful, all-or-nothing resistance that a more honest, faster announcement would have provoked. There is a real tension here between honesty and effectiveness worth acknowledging directly, since disguising the true scope of a reform in order to make it more palatable edges toward a kind of deception, however well-intentioned. Reformers throughout history navigated this tension differently, some choosing transparency at the cost of speed, others choosing gradualism at some cost to full honesty about where things were actually heading. The revolution that announced itself loudly was fought at every step, while the one that arrived quietly, a little at a time, was often finished before anyone organized to resist it. Admiration and resentment turn out to sit far closer together than most people expect, and an image of total, flawless perfection tends to produce more of the second than the first, however impressive the perfection genuinely is. There is a well-documented pattern across history in which public figures who appeared to have no visible weaknesses at all, no missteps, no awkwardness, no ordinary human failing anyone could point to, provoked a quiet resentment among the people watching them that a person with an obvious minor flaw almost never inspired. The flawless figure makes everyone else's own ordinary imperfections feel, by comparison, like failures, and that comparison, however unfair, breeds a hostility that rarely announces itself directly but shapes public sentiment all the same. A single visible flaw, by contrast, a minor clumsiness, a small admitted mistake, an ordinary human moment, gives an audience something to relate to, and relating to someone is a far more durable foundation for genuine popularity than being envied from an intimidating distance ever manages to be. Public figures who understood this instinctively sometimes allowed a small, carefully chosen imperfection to remain visible, not through carelessness, but through a kind of deliberate humility that cost them very little, and earned them considerably more warmth than a flawless image would have. This is different from genuine incompetence, which damages trust in ways no charming flaw ever offsets. It is a narrow, specific discipline, appearing human enough to be liked, without appearing incompetent enough to be doubted. The historical figures remembered most warmly were rarely the ones who seemed to have gotten everything right, but the ones who let one small thing stay visibly, endearingly imperfect, and were loved a little more for it. Winning decisively and knowing exactly when to stop are two entirely separate skills, and history offers a long, sobering list of victors who mastered the first and never developed the second, undoing an otherwise complete triumph by simply refusing to leave it alone. A conqueror who wins a war reasonably, on terms that leave a defeated party humiliated but not destroyed, often secures a lasting peace. The same conqueror, pressing further, demanding more territory, more humiliation, more concessions than the victory actually required, frequently provokes exactly the resentment and eventual retaliation that a more restrained victory would have avoided entirely. The overreach did not make the original victory more secure. It simply planted the resentment that would eventually challenge it, sometimes within a single generation, sometimes at the hands of the very party that had been pushed past what any reasonable settlement required. This pattern shows up far beyond warfare. A person who wins an argument decisively and then keeps pressing the point long after the other party has already conceded converts a clean win into a grievance the other party will carry forward. A negotiator who extracts every possible concession, rather than stopping at a fair and sustainable deal, often finds the resulting arrangement resented and undermined, precisely because it was pushed past the point where the other side could accept it with any genuine goodwill. The discipline required here runs against a natural momentum, since winning tends to create its own appetite for more winning, and stopping deliberately at the moment of clear, sufficient victory requires a restraint that very few victors, in the heat of actual triumph, ever manage to summon. The peace that lasted was rarely the one won most completely, but the one stopped, deliberately, exactly where it needed to be. A fortress can be besieged, mapped, and eventually broken, because a fortress has a fixed shape, a known perimeter, a specific set of walls that an opponent can study and eventually find a way through. Water has none of this. It has no fixed shape for an opponent to study, no rigid position to defend, no single form that once broken ends the whole structure. It simply moves around whatever stands in its way, and in the process wears down even the hardest stone slowly. without ever needing a strategy of its own beyond persistence and the absence of a fixed shape to lose. The oldest strategists in Chinese military and philosophical tradition drew directly on this image, and it turns out to be the quiet idea underneath every other law on this list. Every fixed position, whether it is a reputation defended too rigidly, a strategy repeated past its usefulness, or an identity so specific it can no longer adapt to changed circumstances, eventually becomes a target precisely because it can be studied, anticipated, and eventually broken. A person, or a strategy, without a fixed shape offers nothing solid for an opponent to aim at. There is no single point of failure to exploit because there is no single form to begin with. This does not mean having no substance or no values at all, which is closer to genuine formlessness, failure mode, aimlessness rather than adaptability. It means holding convictions and goals firmly while remaining genuinely willing to change strategy, position, and approach as circumstances shift, rather than becoming so attached to one particular shape of doing things that changing it feels like losing something essential. The 47 laws before this one describe specific shapes power can take. The final one describes what let the person using them change shape at all, long after every rigid strategy around them had already been broken. Water still runs downhill exactly where it always has, and nothing has ever built a wall that stopped it for long. 48 laws, and not one of them new. That was always the strange comfort hidden inside this list, that nothing here was invented recently, and nothing here needs to be invented again by you, alone, through painful trial and error. The same moves that kept an aging minister safe in a suspicious king's court are the moves that keep a talented employee safe from a threatened manager today. The same instinct that told a 17th century courtier to let his rival's ambition run itself into the ground is the instinct that tells a patient person today to simply wait. What changes is the furniture. Courts became boardrooms, duels became emails. The audience changed from powdered wigs to glowing screens. But the underlying architecture of status, attention, and self-interest turns out to be remarkably stable across 400 years, which is either a discouraging thought or a strangely settling one, depending on how you hold it. We opened by noticing two patterns running side by side, an old one moving through history and a small one moving through daily life, and by now you have probably felt them touch more than once, in a memory of your own that one of these laws happened to describe before you had a name for it. Robert Greene did not claim to invent human nature. He only wrote down patiently what centuries of careful observers had already noticed about it, the way a naturalist writes down the habits of a bird, rather than inventing the bird. You do not have to use any of it. Understanding a pattern is not the same as choosing to walk it, and the calmest people in any room are often the ones who can see every move being made around them and decline to make most of them. That too is a kind of power, quieter than the rest, and the book never quite gets around to naming it. Somewhere between the throne room and the office, that quieter law has been patient enough to notice it. Thank you for spending this time here.